Hi everyone, this is Arun from Funnel Envy. Now, if you're a digital marketer these days, you are almost certainly impacted by the rapidly evolving privacy landscape that we find ourselves in. You might be wondering, like many of our customers, how you can continue to do the analytics and understand your visitor and customer behavior and things like revenue attribution in the same way that you did in the past. So, to help clear up some of the confusion and misinformation around this, I recently had a conversation with Paul Pasquale from Seven River Systems. Paul has also been our information security officer at Funnel NV, and we dug in deep into a lot of these issues, including government regulations like GDPR, ad blockers, privacy standards, and even some of the new vendor solutions that are out there. So, with that, let's get into it. Hey everyone, I'm Arun from Funnel Envy, and I'm excited to have with us today Paul. Paul is our privacy officer at Funnel Envy, but he also works with a bunch of other companies on information security, compliance, things like ISO certification, SOC 2, which he helped us go from zero to compliant with a bunch of that stuff. So, hey Paul, good to see you.
Hey, nice to do this. Hey, everybody.
All right. So today, what we're going to be talking about is tracking and analytics tracking and things like attribution in the face of changing requirements, changing browser implementations, ad blockers, all of that kind of stuff. And I think maybe a good way to frame this is in the context of a conversation and a problem that one of our customers was having. So, they came to us and said, look, we're having problems tracking and attributing revenue to about 20% of our users, and their visitor base and user base was relatively technically savvy. So their hypothesis and thinking was this is because of more privacy-centric browsers, ad blockers, that kind of thing, and they wanted to understand what the solutions were. Now, the stack that they use Segment as a CDP and HubSpot as a marketing automation tool. And they wanted to really understand how do we get more better visibility into these visitors, because 20%, 1/5 of their traffic, it's a lot, and they can't track it. So this problem is broadly relevant and certainly relevant for you if you're doing any analytics or tracking at any stage of your journey, but probably actually very relevant for you if you're doing longer term attribution, which is relevant for our customers because we have a lot of B2B demand gen, long customer journey type of marketers. So let's get into the various issues that might be affecting that. And I wanted to start with, Paul, a question for you. Certainly as marketers, we feel this problem about being able to, track and understand our visitors and customers in the way that we used to. But let's flip this around for a second and talk about the actual visitors and users and customers themselves. They're primary actor in this. What are reasonable expectations for them in terms of tracking? And we see, the consent banners and things like that all the time. But what's reasonable for them to expect and do, especially in the face of a lot of the evolving compliance regulations?
Yeah. So really the main thing, if you are a user or a visitor to a site, is the onus is on you as the website owner to be able to provide that user with what is it that how does my privacy change based on how I go on that website, right? So what information are you collecting from me as the visitor, and what are you doing with that information? Because really, when you look at a lot of the laws that are coming online, I mean, certainly GDPR has been going on for a number of years. The California privacy law has been in place for a few. We're starting to see a bunch more come online. Really, all those laws talk about making sure that the user, the visitor to your website, understands what kind of information you're collecting about them, what you're doing with that information. And then it also provides the user with some abilities to, sort of affect their destiny, right, in terms of what they can do. So, really all that starts with what is the information you collect, right? Number one, you have to understand that as the owner of the site, but you also have to be able to articulate that back to the visitor of saying, this is what I'm doing with your data. And that way that user can make that informed decision for themselves on, am I okay with this? Do I want to participate, or do I want to opt out?
Got it. And so if we got a little bit more specific with that, Certainly one part of it is the data that I'm collecting, but then what that site owner is doing with the data. The way I think about it is like there's a chain of custody of data, right? And
Mhm.
in this day and age, you've got all sorts of parties that you may be sharing the data with, from Google Analytics to, platforms like Segment, marketing automation tools. I mean, even if you have, even if you're storing that internally, it's probably not sitting in
Yeah.
your data center anymore. It's probably on some cloud provider. So what's a reasonable expectation for a customer to consent to? Do they actually should we expect them to consent to every single chain in that chain of custody, every single cloud provider out there, or is the are they consenting to the website itself, and the burden is on the website to make sure that their providers fall in line? Can you go into detail there?
Yeah, so generally the burden is going to first and foremost be on the website that's sort of initiating that relationship, right? So if I go to funnelenvy.com and I'm the visitor, you might collect that data on that website, but you may also ship it downstream to Google Analytics based on the trackers. You may send it to Segment. You may look at a bunch of different, right, providers that you're sending this data to. It all starts with you because you're collecting the data, or you're setting me up to have my data collected maybe with some other parties. And so generally, in privacy land, we call this the controller.
Mhm.
So you're the controller of my data. You may not be interfacing with all of it, you may not be processing all of it personally, but you're the one that's sort of controlling how that's done. And so really it all starts with you because you're the one who has a relationship with me as the website visitor. um, all those other websites out there, right? The Segments, the Google Analytics, anything else that you're using in that chain of custody, those are tending to be called, we tend to call them processors.
Mhm.
And processors definitely have obligations under privacy laws, and there's things that they should be doing for themselves. But really, there's almost a relationship between you and those companies to make sure that when you hand off that data, that they're going to treat it in the way that you're going to expect them to treat it, and that me as the visitor, that I'm going to expect it to be treated based on a privacy policy. So I don't think that the user, right, the visitor to your website needs to accept terms with all those downstream providers, right? You're the main interface for that. But what I do see sometimes these days is in privacy policies, some companies will choose to be very, very transparent and saying, hey, as part of the overall user experience you're getting, just be aware that we use these providers. And the level of detail that you want to go into on that is really up to you, right? Some go as far as saying, here's the specific data that we send them, and here's a link to their privacy policy. Others are a lot more vague. It really depends on the volume um, of providers that you work with and what kind of data you ship and all that.
Got it. So it sounds like there's some ambiguity in the
Yep.
implementation across sites. How much of that is affected by the specific regulation I'm complying to? And this is, obviously all of this became raised to the forefront when GDPR came along, but then we've got the California laws. Every state, it seems like in the country, in the US at least, is rolling out their own individual laws. How much variation is there between these various regulations and laws, and how much of that is driving like different implementations?
Yeah. So there's some minor variation in the laws, but for the most part, they're all sort of converging on the same standard, right? It's really, when you look down, when you get down to it, the principles are, you know, the people who are getting their information collected need to understand what's getting collected and what's being done with it. They need to have some sort of say in the process, whether it's opting out or choosing to have their data deleted or something like that. And there's this chain of custody set up where the organization collecting the data and then any kind of downstream processors have some sort of contractual relationship. There's also a lot in there about selling data, right? So, in the context of some of the scenarios we're talking about, we're not necessarily talking too much about organizations that collect data and then sell it, but there are many that do. And so, that's a factor as well. And there are more stringent regulations for organizations that are selling data to other parties versus those that are, just collecting it for their own internal marketing purposes.
Got it. So in this case, we're talking of the use case that we have, and the problem that this specific customer had was more about measuring and understanding their own customer journey, finding bottlenecks, ultimately improving it. So I think, to summarize this conversation, or this part of the conversation on regulations, it's less about that, right? Certainly you have to have transparency and consent as part of the
Yep.
process and understanding of it. But the relationship is primarily with the data controller and the user. And as long as the user is consenting and it's transparent as to how that data is being used, that meets the obligations of of most, if not all, of the various regulatory mechanisms.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. That really, it's about sticking to those principles. And like I said, there's some variations in the various laws, but they are starting to converge, and really it's about getting to those core tenets.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's move on to browser vendors. So I've had people say to me, and I've seen people out there trying to exploit the idea that cookies are dead, and that there's going to be, and some folks taking that to mean that we're going to have a completely cookieless world in a few years. And in 2022, I believe Chrome, which is obviously the dominant browser out there, is going to be phasing out third-party cookies. For context, that is specifically third-party cookies. That's not first-party cookies. But I wonder if you had any thoughts on, how, or you can go into more detail on what that specifically means.
Yeah. Cookies aren't quite dead yet. It's a great headline. It creates a lot of buzz. But really, what we're talking about being phased out are third-party cookies, which is something that's been sort of on the down decline for a while anyway, right? And the difference is, what is a first-party cookie versus what is a third-party cookie, right? So, we'll use you as an example again, right? If I go to funnelmv.com, I may get served a cookie from funnelmv.com. I'll have that on my machine. That'll be used when I interface with you. That can also be used when I'm interfacing with other websites. But generally, it's a cookie that represents my direct relationship with your website. That's a first party cookie. A third party cookie is I go to funnelmv.com and I'm served a cookie from funnelworld.org. And now we're using that cookie to track my movements. And in fact, if you have a whole family of websites, that whole family of websites can use that, funnelworld.org cookie to track me. So that's a third party cookie, right? Because funnelworld.org is a completely different situation. And so that's being phased out. That being said, a majority of the cookies these days are first party cookies, and a majority of the cookies that you use with a lot of these analytics type sites and things like Segment are going to be first party cookies. So, in that sense, cookies aren't necessarily going away, but and I know we're going to get into this a little bit more, there is a lot more awareness these days because of some of these laws, and just because of the inherent focus on privacy, where people are really trying to figure out, how do I minimize the amount of cookie that I have, and so that'll certainly have an effect on all these kinds of trackers.
Yeah, certainly. I think these are all related. But to underscore the point, the death of cookies really refers to the death of third-party cookies, which were
Right.
kind of on their way out. And if you're relying on that for a lot of your marketing, well, you're probably doing a lot of third-party advertising. But for
Yep.
the use case that we talked about, which is, again, being able to track and understand the customer journey over a period of time and do things like attribution, most of that is reliant on first-party cookies. And it's important to understand as well, I think, that even if you're putting a third-party script on your website, that can be using first-party cookies.
Yep.
And it is using first-party cookies for the use cases that we're talking about. So by and large, insofar as it relates to the death of third-party cookies, also not super relevant to this specific thing. Although understanding the implications that third-party cookies can have, and the end of those to other aspects of your marketing, specifically, ad tracking, is important.
Yep, absolutely.
But there is another wrinkle when it comes to browsers, and this is what Safari and the folks at Apple have called intelligent tracking prevention. And intelligent tracking prevention, for those of you who don't know, is in recognition of some of the challenges around cookies, all cookies, not just third-party cookies. Safari, through WebKit, which is the underlying core of Safari, has implemented what they call intelligent tracking prevention. Short form is ITP, which restricts the way that cookies and other signals can be used. Paul, you want to shed some light on this?
Yeah, so this is a pretty interesting, it's not super recent development because ITP's been around for a couple years, but it is constantly getting enhanced, and they are continuously raising the bar on how cookies are treated and tracked and all of that. But essentially, what ITP does is it looks at, using some various machine learning algorithms, how your browser is interacting with a cookie, and it makes some decisions that try to mirror your intent. Right. So, this kind of goes back to how cookies are used in first party, third party, right? Maybe I go to your website as funnelmv.com, I get that cookie. But now that cookie's being used to track me on a whole, suite of websites. And if I'm a regular funnelmv.com user, I'm probably okay with that. Right. Like, actually, a better example would be Amazon, right? If I'm going to Amazon all the time, as a customer of Amazon, I'm probably okay with my cookie being shared a little bit more broadly, because that means that there's opportunity for various vendors and things to be able to give me products and referrals and stuff based on what I'm doing on Amazon. Great. However, in many cases, we have users that go to a website and then maybe they never go to that website again, or they go very infrequently. And so we'll go back to the Amazon example. Say I go to Nile.com, right? Amazon's fictitious competitor,
I like it.
and I look at them once, and then I really don't go to that website again. Well, I'm probably not, as the user, as okay with my Nile.com cookie getting shared around all the time. And so what ITP does is it detects that, and it starts to wall off my cookie. So my Amazon.com cookie, because I go to Amazon all the time, ITP detects that and allows my cookie to be shared out. But my Nile.com cookie, it says, well, Paul hasn't been to Nile.com lately, so we're not going to share his cookie out to other websites. If he goes to Nile.com again, we'll reconsider that. And so practically, what that means from the software perspective is, if you haven't been on a website in more than 24 hours, it starts to wall off where that cookie can be shared. And it even goes a step further, and it says if you haven't been on a website for 30 days, it automatically purges the cookie. So now they're not tracking you at all. And so that definitely creates some barriers as we start to have tracking and analytics across a whole suite of systems, because if that core website, that first party website, isn't visited very often, then it's going to be hard to track them.
Yep, and so I want to dig into this. I like the shout out, by the way, for your e-commerce startup. But I want to dig into this one in a little bit more detail, because now we're getting into things that have practical implications on our use case. First off, to underscore the point, ITP, unlike the GDPR and regulations, which is government led, or the first party cookie conversation, which is a technical distinction. This
Yep.
is an evolving set of standards and requirements that's really driven by a vendor. Now, Firefox has something similar, but in this case, ITP is really driven by Apple. Initially starting with the Safari browser, but now extending actually to all browsers on iOS. So you may have a small share of Safari, but you might have a much more significant share of iOS traffic coming to your site. So this becomes
Yeah.
very relevant. But the other point that you made too is that this is evolving. So initially they just sandboxed. The whole goal is to limit cross-origin tracking.
Yep.
Your example from Amazon to Nile.com is a great one. And there are various ways, not just cookies, that cross-origin tracking can happen. So it started with sandboxing client-side cookies. If back to my prior example, if you have a third-party script that's using a first-party cookie, and Safari through their machine learning that they had knew that was a commonly placed first-party cookie that was used for cross-origin tracking, it would, like you said, sandbox that cookie to
Yep.
4 hours or a week, depending on it. But that has evolved, right? It now also sandboxes local storage, which is another mechanism that that vendors use to put data on the browser that they can be retrieved later for the purposes of tracking. So part of this evolution was also CNAME blocking as well. A lot of vendors, some of whom we've already talked about in this, try to get around some of the limitations of ITP and other browser restrictions and ad blockers by encouraging their customers to use a subdomain. So rather than using the URL to track segment.com, you could use a CNAME like track.funnelenvy.com, and presumably because it was a funnel envy domain, it would be less likely to be blocked. But it turns out that ITP is caught up to this, and they refer to it as CNAME cloaking, and they will also detect that and block, and not block, but sandbox cookies and local storage from CNAMEs as well. So that's insufficient. So the moral of the story here is that this is an evolving standard. It's expressly for the purposes of cross-origin tracking, and you've got to be aware of the evolving nature of it, and make sure that what you're doing will still work in the face of both the traffic that you get from it and how you're trying to measure visitors.
Yeah, it's a great point. And right to that end of they're constantly evolving, the pattern that I see while they're evolving is they're really looking at behaviors, right? So they're not necessarily looking to block specific technologies or techniques or anything like that. They're really trying to find and deal with the cross-origin behavior. And so I am sure that over time they're going to continue to raise that bar, right? Right. There are some solutions that we're going to talk about that I think will work fine today. They may not work as well tomorrow, and so we'll just have to see. But I definitely see where they're looking for evidence of the behavior more than evidence of a particular technology or solution.
That's right. Yep. And from the marketer's perspective, the other thing to keep in mind is this isn't blocking cookies. So you're going to see a different outcome. In some cases, and back to our use case here, they were saying, well, we weren't able to track 20% at all of this traffic. That's not what ITP is going to do. ITP is actually not going to block the cookie. What it's going to do is sandbox it. So what you're likely to see is after a 24-hour period, that visitor might be on the same device, might not have cleared cookies, will come back to the site, and that'll be treated as a new session, or a new cookie will be issued, because Safari has or an iOS browser has effectively deprecated and deleted that cookie on the visitor's behalf because it's been sandboxed. So in your analytics, what you're going to see is an increase in new sessions, an increase in visitors, but they're actually the same people coming back because of ITP. Okay, great. So now moving on to the next topic here, ad blockers and origin blockers. We see more people using those in their browsers, and obviously every major browser supports them. So how do these actually work?
Yeah, so these are working at the browser level, and they are looking for and rooting out a lot of the cross-origin activity. Now, it depends on what ad blocker you use. There's a lot of different ones out there, and they all work slightly different. There are just vanilla ad blockers that they have information on where ads are served from, how they're served, maybe some heuristics on what ads look like from a content perspective. And so it'll just block that. And it'll block ads, but generally ad blockers won't necessarily block tracking and, any kind of analytics and stuff like that. But now there are also these origin blockers. The big one out there right now is, I think, like uBlock Origin is a big popular one. And so they are looking much more broadly at cross origin, cross traffic. And so that's going to block ads just like the ad blockers do, but it's also going to block other stuff. It's going to block the trackers. It's going to block the analytics. It's going to block the behavior algorithms. And it does this by, in some ways just looking at where these requests are coming from, but it also looks for evidence of where your website is serving out content, whether that's a tracker, because that's served out as content, or something else that's not resident on the server, right? So if you're at funnelenvy.com but you're serving out stuff that's on google.com, well, that's kind of suspicious, and so it might just get blocked. And so from a user perspective, it requires a little bit more savvy, right? Because there's a greater chance that it's going to block the good stuff than the bad stuff, right? Going back to my Amazon.com example, if I turn on an origin blocker on Amazon.com, I am going to have a very poor user experience because I'm not going to get to see all the other products that I'm interested in and things that my wife was looking at last night, right? So, I don't know that the adoption is necessarily going to be as high as just a generic ad blocker, but I also think that there's just a lot of users out there that are paranoid and they don't know. And so they're going to put, an origin blocker on there, and, that could definitely hurt in this realm.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think one other point that I'd add to that is it doesn't necessarily have to be something like an extension that you're installing. Some of these features are getting natively incorporated into browsers. Brave is one that's
Yep.
a browser vendor that's natively incorporating origin and ad blocking features. Safari is actually introducing these as well. And again, this is different from ITP because we're not talking about
Yep.
sandboxing. We're talking about actually blocking. And probably the thing that's going to be most apparent initially in your analytics, and the reason that we had that conversation with the customer, is because they were able to correlate it to that 20% drop to certain browsers. So that's the thing that's going to be most apparent. And like you said, it requires a little bit of savvy if it does mean installing an extension. But if you are using one of those browsers, it at least means you're aware and thinking about sort of blocking and ad blocking.
Right. And just like with some of the other things we talked about, like ITP, right, we're going to see it mature over time. So right now it may be that, provides an inconsistent user experience and it's not widely adopted, but over time, I think you're going to see it creep more and more into the mainstream. And so it'll be really important to watch that and see what exactly is going on. That way we can, operate within the confines of what's trying to be solved there, right? Those blockers are, sometimes there because people don't want to be inconvenienced, but it's also there because people are just want their privacy respected. And so I think there's a good, happy place to be where, we can make sure that we are doing this tracking correctly and serving out good content while still respecting people's privacy.
Yeah. So we look at these different buckets, and this is maybe a harder question for you to sort of directly answer, but I think it's an interesting one. Each of these sort of limitations on tracking and analytics are being imposed, and things like consent are being imposed by different actors. In the case of regulation, it's government.
Yep.
In the case of third-party, first-party cookies, it's a technical differentiation that was exploited by certain vendors and players out there. In the case of ITP, it's a specific vendor or two driving the charge. In the case of an ad blocker, it's actually the user themselves that has expressed in some way that they want to limit what they're doing. How do you think the actor that's imposing the limitation should affect the way that we track them as marketers?
Oh, that's a great question. And you're right, that is a tough one. So, um, it, it really depends on where in the scheme of privacy and the spectrum of privacy they're acting, right? Like you said, they're all in different areas. So, um, I think that generally what we see is that the closer things get to the user, um, the more heavy-handed things tend to be,
Mhm.
right? I know that a lot of people, especially in the beginning when we were all scrambling to put it together, might call GDPR or CCPA or some of those heavy-handed, but generally, especially if you're using right your tracking and analytics to be able to do marketing and things like that, it's pretty reasonable. It's, hey, we want people to understand what information is being collected. We want their rights to be respected. We want you to be able to comply if they say, hey, I don't like this. I don't want to participate. You have the ability to use a whole bunch of tactics to implement that, a whole bunch of strategies to implement that, and you can still get your business done and be compliant, right? But as we get further down the spectrum, all the way down to the ad blockers, which are very, very, very user specific, um, they can be a lot more heavy handed because an ad blocker or an origin blocker isn't going to be walking the nuance of, I just want to understand what data you're collecting about me. It's just like, nope, turn it all off.
Right.
So, right, when we get there, it's a lot harder to resolve given some of the technologies that are out there. And so I think when we when we see how do we operate within the confines of the law end of the spectrum, it's really about making sure we've got a good plan and making sure we communicate and all that kind of stuff. But when we start talking about origin blockers, it starts turning into a lot of hacks. And so that's where I personally get a little bit worried, because we can have good hacks and we can have bad hacks, and we don't want to have a hack that inadvertently or maybe advertently ends up violating the law end of the spectrum,
Sure.
right? So it's a very complicated path to walk.
Yeah, you could say that again. It's complicated. So, I mean, you already got into it with hacks, but let's talk about possible solutions. So,
Yeah.
if I remember back with my gray hairs to when I started, web and analytics type of stuff, there was no cloud providers. Everyone was racking servers in data centers. Is that what we have to do? Is that what marketers have to do? Are we back to the Stone Age?
So no, not necessarily. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff out there, but I actually remember those days too. And there is one, I'm hesitant to call it a hack because I guess people always say hacks are bad, even though they're not. But one of the techniques I've seen out there is, I see some companies setting up pipelines where if you've got a user that tracking is blocked on, and the system detects that, it will revert back to that old school server side tracking.
Mhm.
Right. So, hey, we're not seeing anything pop on Google Analytics. Let's fill in that gap by shipping over whatever the server is detecting. And so that is one way to do it. Especially if you're collecting some of that data anyway as part of your server, but it does present some possible problems, right? Because that is that's additional collection that now you're working with. And so if you're going to be generating and collecting that data on your local server, which, a lot of these new tools are geared towards turning that off, right now you've got some additional burden of making sure that you treat that data right.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I want to dive into this topic a little bit more because I've seen, well, there are a plethora of privacy first analytics vendors that have cropped up recently. If you type in privacy first analytics in Google, you're gonna be on the third page of results. You're gonna be seeing new vendors,
Yep.
and I've seen some of them, not pointing any fingers, but conflate the concept of self-hosting with server-side tracking, and they're not the same thing. You can do server-side tracking. So keep in mind a lot of the mechanisms for sandboxing and origin blocking and things like that happen on the browser side, what we call the client side. As a result, there are solutions that are emerging, which are server-side tracking solutions, but that's different. It can work with, but it's not necessarily the same thing as self-hosting. Server-side tracking, if common approach here is to use Google Tag Manager server-side tracking, does the tracking on the server, not in the browser, but can pass that data along to a third party, meaning you're not self-hosting it. Self-hosting means that you're actually bringing that data internal, and of course, internal is vague, right? Because internal means most likely it's going to be on AWS, GCP, or
Yep.
so go if you can break down those discrepancies and your thought on self-hosting versus not self-hosting.
Yeah, so server side tracking, right? Generally, when we say that, we're really talking about, sort of what we just referred to, right? The old school, right? Your server is collecting logs on who visited the website. That's IP address, could be refer, browser, all those things that get done on that exact server. Self-hosting is a little bit different. Self-hosting is about taking an entire, sort of a miniature version of the analytics platform and deploying it within your infrastructure, usually your cloud infrastructure, right? So you can't really argue that that's server side, because really it's all happening on another server somewhere. The difference is, instead of you interfacing with somebody on another network, on another system, another platform, it's all being done ideally in your internal network. So, I mean, they're similar in the sense that you run them both on your side, but they're different in what the architecture looks like.
Mhm.
Now, generally, I tend to worry about solutions like this. It depends on your company, depends on how big you are. Do you have, a large cadre of system administrators, security personnel, stuff like that? But, one of the conversations that I always have with companies about cloud is, I know that cloud has risks, but generally the cloud providers out there are very, very focused on making sure they offer privacy and security, and they're implementing that. And they have very large teams that devote their entire day to doing that. If you're going to take some of the functionality that they provide and bring that in-house, you need to be able to replicate that security and privacy in-house. And so, you've insourced that problem now, and you have to be able to solve it in-house. And so it's not just as simple as point, click, deploy. Now I have it in my network boundaries and I don't have to worry about it anymore. No, actually, in some ways you got to worry about it more, because you have to make sure that all that data stays secure.
Yeah, it's similar to the conversations that we had back when Gmail was rolling out, right?
Yep.
Why, or Yahoo Mail? Why would I trust Yahoo or Google to be more secure than hosting my own mail server? It's because they have an army of people dedicated to that,
Yep.
right? And they can allocate those resources across many different customers, and it's kind of the same conversation. It's if where is a data breach, for example, most likely to happen? Is it sure Google or Yahoo or whatever the provider is going to have a larger surface area, but as a consequence of that, if you trust them to manage the security, that the likelihood of some kind of security incident could very well be less.
Right. And especially with a lot of these third parties that deal with analytics and personal data. I mean, they have to keep this stuff really locked down and be very, very serious about it in order to have a viable business model. I mean, if there's a breach where they're responsible for spillage of personal data of a large amount of people, they're essentially out of business, right? The trust is gone. And so they take it very seriously. I'm an advocate. We've talked about this before, of making sure you do your due diligence on vendors, and making sure they can provide all the right documentation to show that they're secure and compliant and all that stuff. But provided that they do, I generally find, as long as there's no technical barriers or anything like that, that it's a better option to have it out being managed by someone who really, really knows what they're doing.
Yeah, because of you, one of the first things I do when I have a conversation or even get to go to a possible partner's website is check out the GDPR, SOC 2
Yep.
compliance, all of that. And I think I'm not alone in that anymore, right? That's what everyone's doing.
Right.
So what about some other options for tracking? I've heard a lot about cookieless tracking solutions. Wondering if you have any opinions on that. Do we need to go to a cookieless tracking world?
Yeah, so there are more and more of those that are coming out. You know, I won't go into any names here, but you can Google them. There's a lot of them. So those are interesting because they are trying to replicate some of the functionality of Google Analytics, but in a smaller and tighter way. So one of the interesting things about, when you're doing things like Google Analytics, and I keep using that one because it's the most well known, but there are others as well, is because of the way their tracking works and because of the infinite customization of the reports that you can provide, they collect a ton of possible data points on you, and generally you're only going to use a small fraction of those data points when you're making some of your analytics decisions. So what some of these cookieless trackers do is they look at the kind of data that would be done on the server side tracking side, but they're doing it in a third party context.
Okay.
So it's kind of like the best of both worlds between the server side tracking and the off network tracking that we just talked about. But
How
they're
does
also limiting the aperture. Go ahead, sorry.
Now, I was going to ask, how does this relate to fingerprinting? Because I don't know how many folks are doing it, but
Yeah.
fingerprinting is a thing, right? And I know it's something that browsers are trying to crack down on, but it's still this chicken and egg game, right? Of browsers trying to leapfrog folks that are using techniques like fingerprinting.
Yeah, so not all of the cookieless trackers do fingerprinting, but you can use that kind of strategy to do fingerprinting. So fingerprinting is really interesting, in the sense that it does a little bit of detective work to figure out who you are, right? So, this whole conversation about privacy is really about what does a company know about you, the individual, not necessarily the browser you use or the machine that you're on or preferences of a buyer, but all of that stuff linked to you as the person. And so when we start looking at some of these cookieless tracking solutions, let me talk about that one first. Really, we're closing the aperture where we're not collecting as much data, and
Mhm.
there's a lot of anonymization going on, meaning we're going to get the kind of analytics that we want to see, but we're going to collect it in a way where there's no way that anyone could ever trace back to me personally.
Mhm.
And so that's great because that helps deal with a lot of the legal and regulatory stuff, because that's really about tracking to an individual. And if you can't narrow down to an individual, now you don't have to worry about those regulatory requirements as much anymore. But here's what's interesting. If you take all those different data points, like what browser is being used, what language is being used, what geographic location is the person coming from, right? There are so many different data points that you can collect from a machine, from a browser, about the session without collecting any personal data, and you could potentially put all those pieces together to figure out who is the individual that I'm looking at. And that's called fingerprinting. And that's very interesting because it is a way to figure out who the individual is without going after some of those really, private pieces of data like IP address and stuff. But at the end of the day, you're still identifying an individual. So it is a little bit interesting in the sense that, depending on which law you're on, you may not be subject to it, but you're kind of within the spirit of what that law is trying to govern.
Right. Yeah, and that's where when I think about fingerprinting, that's when you've really got to read the fine print on the regulation and the
Yeah.
law, and also think about what the user, right, and what they're because fingerprinting is a non is an they're not it's usually not something they're consenting to.
Yep.
Okay, so if I had to summarize all of this, then there's a lot of actors that are this privacy era that we're entering is actually um, a function of lots of different actors imposing additional regulations or burdens or requirements in lots of different ways, right? So it's not a single thing. It's not a single monolithic thing. It's multifactorial. Governments with their regulations, browsers, dealing with cracking down on sort of technical exploits, users themselves. Obviously indicating if through the use of both consent as well as blocking extensions, their own perspective or interest in being tracked. So first off is just making sure you understand all of this and understand the various ways that all of these competing forces can impact your ability to measure and track customers. From a solution perspective, I guess what I'd say based on this conversation is that it doesn't mean, and you probably shouldn't in most cases, run out and start self-hosting everything. Understand the differences between server-side tracking, things like cookieless, which one is more appropriate for your environment. Those can still coexist with third-party vendors, as long as your users and your customers have consent, have a way to consent to that and understand, and you're transparent about the use of their data. Is that about right?
Yeah, that is exactly on. And really a lot of it comes down to, just as everything in marketing, right? Knowing your audience, right? If you've got a really, really savvy audience that's very concerned about this sort of thing, it is going to require an in-depth look at how do we architect this in a way that gets you the data that you need while still making sure that you're compliant and within the realm of the law, and being able to get some data. If your audience is not as savvy, you might not have to worry about some of this stuff. But I do expect that the bar is going to continue to rise over time. So it is a space that has to get watched.
Cool. Well, any other suggestions or thoughts for marketers and the privacy teams that they work with as they confront these issues?
Um, we covered a lot here.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing I'll just add is, we talked about how this is an evolving space, and so it's really, really important to watch it. Right. I know that when we work together, right, we tend to look at things at least twice a year and say, hey, what's coming up? What's changing in the legal space? What kind of technologies are out there? And so it's important to do those reviews on whatever frequency makes sense for a business, because most of the time these things don't just turn like from off to on in a day, right? This is an evolving space that usually every time we start seeing a shift, it's like 6 months to a year out. And so especially like ITP, right, that's been in the works for years. So I think it's really important to keep an eye on things and track them, because you can start lining up any shifts that you have to make or questions you need to ask well in advance of it turning into a blackout for you.
Yep, absolutely. And I guess I'd close out with there are a lot of folks selling snake oil or magic bullets. Hopefully, through the course of this conversation, we shed some light on the complexity of this topic, because it can be easy sometimes to hope that there's one single silver bullet solution to all of this, but there isn't. So really understanding it, developing your own policies, and like Paul said, maintaining those over time is ultimately what's going to get you there.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for listening in. Paul, it's great to chat again. And I see we're already a minute late for our next security review, so we better get back to it.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks.
All
Bye.
righty. Bye.